want to thank Jacob for inviting me, for having something like this. This is special. For Miss Sonia sharing her story, thank you so much. That was so encouraging. And as she said, I don't know why you're here. You may be here as a support to someone, or maybe in your own life you're dealing with things. What is a guarantee is that we're all at some point going to be dealing with things. If you want to call dealing with things the term for suffering, affliction, pain, sorrow. It's no respecter of persons. It comes to us all. And what I have found in 20 years of pastoring, walking with others, is that most of the time we're not prepared for it. Most Christians have not been given the tools and the theology and the foundation to be ready when it comes. And when it comes, it is devastating. And often our lives are thrown upside down. And that was the story for me and my wife. My wife, Katrina, and I, we started dating while I was in the Army. We grew up going to school together, but we decided, no, that's too convenient to date. Then you need to go to the Army and go away, and then we'll start dating. So then it's a long-distance relationship. That'd be fun. So that's what we did. And I was in the 82nd Airborne, jumped out of airplanes there at Fort Bragg, and I ended up getting out and coming back home and getting married to my wife. And it wasn't long after we were married that we found out we were having our first child. And so excited, I just, all these dreams about having children, and especially having a boy. And we were told after several months of the pregnancy, you are indeed having a boy. And just my mind and my heart just leapt, It's like, man, I'm the last male Reed on my side of the family. It's all girls. And so, like, from the time I was little, the family was like, you got to have a son, and it was like, okay, like I'm 8, But I felt that pressure from the time I was a little kid, like, hey, you have to have a male heir, And so I always had that like unspoken pressure, and then I found out, like, you are. So I was like, whew, like, we can just live now, I'm having a boy, and my family will keep me around. So we found out we're having a son. But on one of our visits, we ended up going to the doctor because my wife was hurting. She was about 26 weeks. She was having back pain. They thought it was her kidneys. So we went in. She did an ultrasound. She was looked at. And what we discovered was not that her kidneys were messed up, but that there was something going on with our son. And he was measuring, he wasn't measuring big enough. And she was showing that she was further along than what she actually was. And we were counseled with the doctor afterward, and he said there's a mass inside of his stomach, and we don't know what it is. And I started asking, like, yeah, but like, you kind of know what it is, right? Like, could you just give me a hint of like what you think? You've been doing this for a long time. Maybe you could tell us what you think. I know you're referring us to somebody, but, and he was like, honestly, I don't know. And of course, we went home, and we had a 2-week gap between our appointment with a specialist. And this was the first time in my life that I'd ever had to deal with like this fear of what's going to happen, the unknown. And I remember even calling back to the doctor's office, like, so do you think it's like, is it solid? Is it fluid? Like, I'm just trying to squeeze anything out of him because we felt so out of control all of a sudden. And he said, I don't know. So 2 weeks later, we went to a specialist, and the specialist did some ultrasounds, and he said, well, you've got an issue here. Your son has a kidney that's got cysts all over it. It's filling up. It's taking over his abdomen. But it looks like his other kidney is good. And so what's going to happen is you need to, when you have him, he's going to have a surgery to remove that bad kidney. And so we knew that at about 26 weeks, right? 28 weeks at that point. But 2 weeks later, my wife's water broke, and we found ourselves in the hospital, and she delivered him the next day. So he was 10 weeks early. He weighed 4 pounds and 12 ounces. And then after they drained all the fluid that had collected from those cysts, he weighed 2 pounds and 2 ounces. Little bitty thing. And their goal was to try to get him bigger, healthier, before they then took that bad kidney out. And so they tried to just, keep him in the hospital, keep those tubes in to keep the cysts drained. But he started getting infections, started getting sick from having those tubes in. And so it got to a point 2 months later that we were kind of like, it's a risk. Having surgery at this size is a risk, but leaving these tubes in is a risk because he's getting super sick from this. And so the doctors, counseled with us, and they decided we're going to go forward with the surgery. And so, the goal here was have the surgery, take out the bad kidney, and go home and really live a normal life from that point on, right? One good kidney, a lot of people only have one good kidney, it'd be fine. And so we were excited that this nightmare that had been going on for almost 3 months at that point was about to be something of the past. So the surgery happens, and the surgeons come out, and they're like, everything went well, he did great, we just need to wait for him to pee, and we'll get out of here. You get home and get to life. And then pee that afternoon or that evening, and they started pumping him full of fluids to kickstart the kidneys after surgery, or the kidney after surgery. And the next morning, not only has he still not peed, he is swelling up, and his blood pressure is skyrocketing, 212 over 115, and his heart rate is racing, and they know something's wrong. And they start running tests, and what they discover after hours of taking him in and out of the room and running tests, and we're sitting there, and we know our little radars, even though we're 22, know something's off, right? Something's off. And the surgeon comes back in that afternoon and says, it's unfortunate, but in doing the surgery on your son, we accidentally removed his good kidney in addition to his bad kidney. And your reaction, just imagine our reaction in the room, just devastated. And our lives were turned upside down completely. And all kinds of questions. What does that mean for him? What does that mean? Can he live? Can they do anything? What's our actions? And we sat in a room that night. I said we were 22. We were 24 years old. And we sat in a room that night with surgeons and doctors and hospital staff and dialysis people, and they presented an option to us to try some things on our son that had never been done at a children's hospital, or to do nothing. And do nothing means just let his body eventually do what it's going to do, which is going to be shut down. And we said, we'll try. We'll try if you think something could work. And they began a plan of doing dialysis, and that dialysis would try to keep him around long enough to qualify for a kidney transplant. And so for the next 2 years, that's what we did. We did dialysis. We had catheters put in. He did both kinds of dialysis, peritoneal, hemodialysis, going to the hospital for hours at a time. But I want to go back to the day after we got the news. My wife couldn't walk in the room. She couldn't even be in the room with our son because it was so devastating to her. And I remember sitting there in the room with my son, all these tubes, all these monitors, all these beeping machines, all these questions. And I had a Bible in my lap, I had a notebook in my hand, and I was in ministry at that point. I was interning at a church. I was hungry for the Lord. I wanted to walk with the Lord. I wanted to help others to walk with the Lord. I had come to faith while in the Army towards the end of my time, and was just eager to serve the Lord and wanted others to have their eyes open the way my eyes had been open, and that they'd been shut for so many years. And I had no answers for this. Nobody had ever prepared me for how to think about suffering and think about, where's God in this? How could this happen to us? Like we were going to church, and we were serious about our faith, and we were trying to help others to know, like, this is not supposed to happen to people like us. I just had no tools. I was not equipped at all to know what to think about this and how to grapple with it in my heart. And I'm looking at my son, my only son, and I remember sitting down, and I didn't even know where to go. I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know what to look for. I still wasn't that versed in the Bible very well. And I remember I was just flipping. Like I didn't have a place. I was like, yes, this will comfort me. I was going, God, I got to have some answers, because I have a wife that can't even look at her son. And I remember getting to the book of Daniel, and the only thing I knew about Daniel was from when I went to church with my grandmother as a kid, and about Daniel in the lion's den. I didn't know any other part of the story. And I got to the first chapter, which basically says God gave over Israel to Nebuchadnezzar, and he plundered Israel. And he took their best and their brightest and he shipped them off. And he gave them new identities and new lives and new names. And immediately I was just dumbstruck. I'd never read it, had no idea. And I felt like, boy, I could identify with what those guys feel like. Their whole lives in front of them, dreams about what life would be like. And all of a sudden, everything's different. They're gone. Their families, they're separated from. Their names are not even the same anymore. They don't even speak the language of where they're going anymore. Everything has changed. And that's the way I felt. I felt like, man, I can identify with this. And I kept reading. And of course, some of you are like, oh yeah, we know the story of Daniel. Like, I didn't. And I'm reading. And I'm like, oh man, he's trying to make them bow down to a statue. And I was like, what are they going to do? You know, like I had no idea what was going to happen. And I remember they refused to bow down. And I remember getting to Daniel 3, and it talked about how Nebuchadnezzar, when he heard about it, summoned them to come. And Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego came, and he told them, you're gonna bow down when you hear the music, or I'm going to throw you into that furnace. And the furnace is so hot, not only can they feel the heat on their faces as he threatens them, but they saw someone else consumed by the fire as they were trying to make it hotter. And what they said to him is, O king, we have no need to answer you in this manner. For our God can deliver us from your hand, O king. And I remember that moment writing down in my notebook, our God can deliver us. Daniel 3:17. I remember looking at my son, those monitors, and having all those fears and thinking, God can deliver us. God can save our son. He can get him through this. And it was true, and I needed to remember that. And then I read verse 18. Which I wish I wouldn't have read. It said, but even if he doesn't, they said, but if not, we will not bow down. Serve your gods or the statue that you've set up. I liked the first one better. God can deliver us. I wanted to cling to that. I had no mental categories for but if not. These young Hebrew boys had a theology of suffering, even death, that said, our God, who has the power to save us, may let us die in this moment. He can deliver us. He can do it. And this is why it's so hard for us. Right? It's why Sonia talked about anger. It's why all of us, when we go, how? God, why? It's the song that Shannon just sang. How long, O Lord? Why, O Lord? Where are you, O Lord? Like, if you can deliver us, why are we ever not delivered? And I didn't have a place to even think about how these boys could be okay with saying, even if he doesn't save us. In other words, they had room in their thinking about God, their theology, that said, God has the prerogative not to save us. And he's still good. And I didn't know what to do with that. And I sat there for hours. I wrote down in that notebook, God doesn't have to save us. And I couldn't go any further from that. I just sat and stared at that and I said, why have I never been taught this? They understood this. And of course, over the years that would follow, I would read more and more of the Bible and begin to recognize this is actually everywhere. When Jesus says, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm not going to take away that thorn in your flesh. I know you've asked me 3 times. I know you've suffered greatly for the kingdom. You've been shipwrecked. You've been beaten to death. You've been jailed. You've been starving and naked and everything else. And you never asked me for being saved in those moments. Not that we have recorded, but something was so bad that he said 3 times, Lord, would you remove it? And Jesus said, no, but I'll be enough in it. And I don't know what to do with that. When my whole theology growing up was if you just do the right things, God's supposed to keep the path clear for you. And I didn't have any theology that says, no, but even if he doesn't, you're supposed to keep being faithful. You're supposed to trust him. That word's been used a lot tonight too. That story and other points that came from it became for me the only theology of suffering I had going forward from that day. And over the next 2 years, we would spend time in the hospital, and my son would get sick and have surgeries. And I began to grapple with the fact that there was a good possibility that I may bury my son before they bury me one day. And passages like Psalm 16 or Psalm 139, verse 16. All my days, right? You saw my unformed substance. And in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me. when as yet there wasn't one. God wrote all the days of my son's life. And I remember thinking and being comforted by it, though I still wanted to have my son forever and forever and forever. Lord, I don't ever want to have to see him gone. Take me first. Yet, his days are written in your book. So there's nothing that a surgeon can do to take any of those days away. And there's nothing that anything else can be done to be added to them. You have a plan. Now that doesn't lead me to fatalism. It still leads me to pray and beg and seek God. And yet it gave me a comfort in that moment that I'm not left to chance here. About 2 years in, after his surgery that went wrong, we were running out of time. His blood vessels had been clotting because of the dialysis. It was just such a heavy load on his little body. And we were down to the wire, and they retested my wife and I. We were both not matches, and she came back as a match. And miraculously was able to give him her kidney. And life changed for us after that. The first 2 years were about as bad as you can imagine. And then he got a kidney transplant, which also came with all the things, right? Lots of medicines and special formulas. And like there was no such thing as normal for us. But it was way better than the 2 years before. And he still gets sick all the time because his immune system had to be knocked down because of immune suppressing drugs for his kidney transplant. Hey, but we were like, hey, we're good though. He's got a kidney. And my son, Caleb, he went to school. If you didn't know his story, you wouldn't know any different, right? We were long-suffering Tennessee fans. He got he suffered with the rest of us with how awful we've been. And, we'd go to Nashville Preds games. My son loved hockey. And, he lived a normal life with all his friends. And he played video games. And, he went to summer camps with me and as I would preach. And, if you didn't know any different, if you didn't know his story, you didn't know what he had been through, and even to a large degree what he still went through. He had a feeding tube because it messed all of his developmental stuff up from eating. So he got most of his nutrition through a feeding tube that we hooked him up to at night. He had respiratory issues, and he got hooked up to a vest a couple of times a day to shake him up, and he'd cough and clear. But he'd be doing it while he's gaming, watching his, playing 2K and screaming at the TV with his friends, So it's like, we just dealt with that. Was just normal for us. We just dealt with it, And all through that time, we're continuing to learn about it. How to trust God through suffering. Our bubble had been burst that thought, life was always going to be easy and carefree for us. So we were still trying to mature in our understanding of pain and suffering, and had lots of conversations with our son. Imagine having to tell your kid, like, hey, so this was your story, as he's finally old enough to comprehend what happened to him. Why do I have to do this vest that shakes me up, even though my friends don't have anything like this? Why do they eat food with their mouth, but I got this thing in my stomach, and we just had lots of conversations, and we had to have a lot of talk about suffering and where's God in suffering. And his favorite book of the Bible was Job because he resonated so much with pain and sickness and yet trying to trust God in the middle of it. In the fall of 2017, my son was 13 years old, and he was having some eye issues. He was having some blurry vision, and took him into the doctor to get it looked at, and they started running some tests, but nothing was coming up immediately. But then he was having headaches and just was feeling sick, and it was just so routine for us. Like, let's just go to the hospital, get him checked out, like get it tuned up. Like we going to the hospital and staying there was not a thing for us. And of course, we have two more daughters. We had two daughters that came after him, and we just had a routine. It's like he gets sick, we kick into motion. Mom stays at home with the girls, so they still look like girls when they go to school the next day. And Dad goes to the hospital with Caleb. Pack the bag, and we do our thing. And we went to the hospital, and they started running tests, and my son went into a coma. And as they started to run even more tests, they discovered that he had something called fungal meningitis, and he had a stroke. And he was unconscious for 3 weeks. And what had felt like, again, 2 years of just complete terror to 11 years that felt somewhat normal, though still filled with just all the things. We felt like we were back to square one again, not knowing what we were going to get back, if we ever got our son back at all. I remember reading in 1 Samuel 3:18 during that time when Eli was told that, or Samuel was told that Eli's sons were going to be killed. And the next morning Eli said, "What did the Lord tell you? Tell me everything." Samuel told Eli, "The Lord's going to take your boys." And Eli's response, 1 Samuel 3:18, I never understood it, but I do more now. He said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." And I remember reading that when my son was unconscious and we had no idea what we were getting back. If we were getting him back at all. It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Now, I'm sure Eli didn't say that calloused and cold, did he? I imagine his eyes were filled with tears and his heart with sorrow. And yet there was something there about trusting God. And that season for us became about learning to trust God at whole new levels. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 went beyond a coffee mug or a t-shirt verse for us. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. And I remember reading that and thinking, okay, trust the Lord with all your heart. And then the counter to that, which is what I want to do, is do not lean on your own understanding. You don't have to get it. You don't have to grasp what God is doing. You don't have to be able to trace the hand of the story to make sure you like the story. You don't have to see his infinite wisdom on full display. You just trust him without having to understand all those things. And I'm like, but Lord, and he's like, trust me. Trust me. And I'm like, can you tell me why this is going on? Then if you give me the reason, I'll trust you. And he's literally saying, lean not on your own understanding. But that's us, isn't it? That's humans, isn't it? We want to know. I want to be able to approve, even though you don't need my approval. And that became for us a passage just going back to, Lord, we're just going to trust you. And people would say, this was devastating news for us. Everybody in our community knew about it. And people knew Caleb's story from all over the place. And they knew what we were now going through. And they'd say, how are you doing? How are you doing? And we'd just say, we're just trying to trust the Lord. We're just trying to trust the Lord. Pain. And I remember I was battling crippling anxiety the first 7 years of Caleb's life, and I'd finally gotten past anxiety and panic attacks, and I was learning to trust the sovereignty of God and the wisdom of God and the goodness of God, even though I didn't understand why certain things were going on. And I remember being in the ICU with him, and he was still unconscious, going on several weeks. And I remember my mind just racing off into all these places of, what if he's just like this forever now? What if I felt my heart rate begin to increase and the panic began to increase, and I had to go back to, but Lord, you're sovereign, you're wise, and you're good. If that be the case, whatever my worst fear is, if that's what you bring, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you, because my fear and my not being able to control things, right? I'm not changing anything. All I can do is just trust you right now, even though it's really hard. And I remember Caleb finally came out of the coma after 3 weeks, and he had lost all of his motor skills. He had lost all of his ability to talk, and his mind was there, though. He was still able to remember things, and he still understood who he was. Like, all the mental capacities were intact, but his motor skills and those things that he was able to do before, now he couldn't. And communicating with him became blinking our eyes and using fingers, and everything changed. And he went to Atlanta for rehab to try to get some motor skills back, and he had climbed all the way back to being able to walk by the time he left Atlanta. But shortly after returning home, he started dealing with neurological pains, just side effects from the stroke. They couldn't pinpoint the source of the pain. They couldn't fix it. They tried everything, and so he just lived in a lot of pain every day. And he also was dealing with respiratory issues, because unlike before, he didn't have the ability to cough when he needed to. Same reason why those things didn't fire to allow him to speak. It didn't fire to get him to cough either. And so now we're having to do other types of things to try to keep his lungs clear. And we're in and out of the hospital again, doing antibiotics. And for 2 years. That's what we spent all of our time doing. It's the hardest 2 years of our life. We were full-time caretakers for an entire year before we finally got some help with a nurse. In the fall of 2019, in November, we had to take him in because his oxygen levels were low, and again, just lungs, and we took him in to get a tune-up, to get some antibiotics and clear his lungs out again before we go home and last as long as we can before we have to repeat the process. Except for he didn't come home with us this time. He'd been there about 3 weeks, and he wasn't improving. And yeah, I didn't think anything about it. I just thought, yeah, well, they'll change up medications. And I remember the first time the doctor said, hey, we probably need to talk at some point about just what to do if he doesn't get better, because he may not be getting better. And all those things that I had thought about as a dad in the room sitting beside him wondering, are they going to bury me before they bury my son, or the opposite, was now becoming a reality. I told my wife, who was at the home with our girls, and she was devastated, as you can imagine. And we had to sit down with our doctor, who been with Caleb the last 2 years, a complex care doctor who was just an incredible man, who's retired now, and I've been trying to help lead him to the Lord, and we're having lots of incredible conversations. But we sat down in a room together and agreed that the most gracious thing that we could do for our boy was to quit putting him through more pain, to take this mask off and let him pass. My son loved Jesus. He knew the Lord. He was a joyful, joyful kid. My only son. And we went into that room with him after talking to that doctor, and he was conscious. He was awake, but his body was so sick. And I said, Caleb, do you want to go be with Jesus? And he blinked 2 times really big. Yes. Yes. And just gave me a grin. And we called our family and our friends, and they all came, and we surrounded his bed, and we sang 10,000 Reasons, his favorite song. Bless the Lord, oh my soul. And we read scripture together, we prayed, and I rubbed my little boy's head, and my little girls held his hand and his arm, and my wife was holding him as we said goodbye to him, and he passed and went to be with the Lord. And all those things that I had feared and worried about for 15 years were now real life for us. He was gone. And the relief that it gave to us in terms of taking care of him and all the strain that came with that only gave way to just deep heaviness of his absence. The permanence is what's so heavy. And I've told people since then, it's like trying to describe being under a squat bar to somebody, and to talk about the weight, to talk about how you feel it in your neck and your shoulders and then in your legs pressing down. You can describe it, but here's the deal. There's nothing that describing it that can do to actually replace getting under the bar and feeling it. It's a different experience when you feel it. And I said, that's the heaviness of the permanence. It's just in front of you. It's just on you. And so now our grief and our mourning and our trust is about clinging to the Lord for grace to keep going the next day now. It's about help in our time of need each day. And it's still requiring faith every day, because my mind will start wandering off, and it'll say, well, What happens if you live 40 more years? And 40 more years, if I live 40 more years, 40 years without him. 40 years, well, I even remember what his little voice sounded like. And then I have to remind myself, you know what, Eric, the Lord will be, if you're alive 40 years from now, you know who's going to be there with you 40 years from now? The Lord. The same Lord who's with you here today is going to be there with you 40 years from now if he lets you stay. And you know what that means? You don't have to sweat 40 years from now today. You don't have to live under the fear of what you're not going to have 30 minutes from now. I need to trust God for today. Today, for right now. Because enough, tomorrow's problems are enough, Jesus said. Right? Tomorrow's problems are enough. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. Look to God for help today. Look to him today to be your all-sufficient grace. Look to him today to be the one that holds you together. Why are you worried about 50 years from now's grace? Cling to him for today's. And that's the lesson that God taught us and is still teaching us. I miss my son every day. There's not a day I don't think about him. He's on my little phone, my cover screen. Every time I unlock my phone, he's there. I don't mean there, and I mean like right there. I think about that boy every day. My only son. I've also learned to not put lots of weight on things that don't need a lot of weight. You know what? We're not going to have another male Reed. Whoop-de-doo. Whoop-de-doo. Because it's all in the Lord's hands. My little girls will have some kids. And they'll be called something different. And praise God. Who cares? You see, the Lord's refocused a lot of things that we often think used to matter. His pain, his sickness, his illness over 15 years has just taught us to not get too uptight about a lot of things. Don't get too frustrated when schedules aren't working out. Don't get flustered when I'm at a red light and somebody's not going. I mean, I want you to go, but... right? I mean, step on it. But it just has a way of reframing a lot of things. And this is the other thing, too. I've often asked the question, you know, what would happen if the Lord took one of my girls? And all of a sudden that fear grips my heart. My mind starts racing down that road, and I have to pull it, rein it back in, take those thoughts captive in obedience to Christ. And I say, no, Eric. The Lord hasn't given you the grace to imagine that loss. He only gives you the grace to be in the things you're in. He doesn't give you a grace to imagine the things you're not in. Please hear this. I hear Miss Sonia's story and I go, oh God, how could I endure that? Well, the same way that she did. Because God will supply the grace you need in it. He doesn't supply the grace you need to think about being in it. He doesn't give you the grace to imagine going through it and then being okay with it. That's not how it works. It's grace for the hour. It's daily bread. Like manna from heaven that has to be sought every day. With open, childlike hands. And that's the way we now live our life. We grieve, we lament, we say, how long, oh Lord? I think about those parents in Nashville who now feel that loss and that permanence and that heaviness. And I go, God, I know. I can't imagine going through what they're going through. Somebody would say, hey, but you've lost a kid too. I can't imagine what they're going through. And I don't have to be okay with imagining it. I just pray that God will sustain them with His grace. One day all things will be made new. You know, my daughter, my youngest, she was 6, she's now 9. When Caleb passed, it's been over 3 years. We were riding down the road, she started crying, and she said, Daddy, I miss Bubba. And he loved her so much. She didn't remember Caleb before he had the stroke. She was just a little bitty girl. Her memories of Bubba are a Bubba who sits in the chair and just pets on her with his arm when she comes over. And she just get up in the chair and straddle him and just hug his neck and squeeze him. We'd be like, okay, Kyra, calm down, And he would just grin, He would just grin. He loved her, and she's mean. She's the mean one in our family. Like Caleb was the rule follower. Kaylee, my 13-year-old, rule follower. Sweet peas, right? Like if they think they offended you, they're crying over it. Kyra's the one who will cut you. Right? Kyra's the one that reminded me, you're not writing a parenting book, bro. Like, it was grace that your first two kids are anything like what they are. Not because of you, because look at Kyra, right? So that, the savage, we call her. She was crying and she said, Dad, why did God make it this way? And I gave her kind of the daddy preacher answers at first. I was like, well, baby, the sin is in the brokenness of the world, sin's in the world, and it wasn't supposed to be that way. It wasn't that way at the beginning, right? I'm giving her all the right answers. But she said, no, Dad. I mean, but if God could have made it differently, why didn't he make it different? And again, I wasn't getting it. I was like, well, he did. You see, he did make it different, but then we sinned. But one day, she said, no, Dad. One day in heaven, there's not going to be any more sin or suffering or death. She was 6. That's where her little mind was going. There's not going to be any of those things because God's going to end all of that. It won't ever be. Why didn't God just start it that way? And I was like, and my heart sincerely prayed, Lord, please protect her little heart. And this was the only answer I could give her. It's the only answer I can give any of us. There's something about this kind of world where there's pain and grief. There's painful goodbyes. There's devastated relationships. There's loss and separation. There's something about that kind of world where God gets maximum glory and we get maximum joy because we experience Him for what and who He is that we would not experience without that world. Let me explain what I mean. Without sin, you would never know God is gracious and merciful. You'd never know Him as Redeemer. You'd never know Him as kind. You'd never know Him as forgiving. Because you'd have no experience of needing God in that way. Without suffering and afflictions and sorrow, you would never know God as comforter, as healer, as sustainer, as the one who will restore and redeem all things. In other words, for all of eternity, think about all the reasons why we're going to marvel at the majesty and goodness and greatness of God. Because He saved us, forgave us, redeemed us, gave us grace and mercy, healed us, sustained us, comforted us, and carried us through to the end, and made all things new as the restorer of creation. We will worship Him for all of eternity for that reason. Because He's all of those things. And without that kind of world, you'd have never known Him as any of those things. And I said this to her. I said, baby, that's the only answer I can give you. Apart from this kind of world that needs a redemption and restoration at the end, we would never know God for who He is. And watch, and He would never get the maximum glory that He will get because of those things. So you know what that means? Between now and that day, we cling to His promises, we trust Him, and we ask Him to keep giving us day after day grace in our times of need. And this is what He promises. He will.
Amen.
He will. So trust in the Lord with all your heart. Grieve and lament and cry out, why, O God? How long, O Lord? These questions do not offend Him. He can handle it. He was the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. If you ever question the love of God for you, look no further than Calvary's tree. And see that the purchase of all your suffering and sorrows, all your tears collected in His bottle, were one at the cross for you. And the hope of your resurrection and restoration of this groaning world waiting its redemption is answered in Christ. Amen. Apart from Christ, we don't have any hope. And so I live my life, my ministry at church, knowing Jesus Ministries, trying to help people cling to that hope, to trust Him when it's hard, to equip believers who for the most part have not been equipped with the tools to handle these things. That's what our ministry does. KJM, we have a Hopeful Sufferers weekend for families who have lost children. It pays completely for all their flights, travels. We have people from all over the country that come in, parents who have lost kids, and we just minister to them for a weekend. They minister to us. And we spend time with people who get the pain. And it's really important to do that. As Sonia was saying, you need to get around people who get the pain, because you'll learn really quick you're not alone. You're not alone. And that's why I think what Jacob's doing here with this is so important, because you can look around the room and realize you're not alone. And mutually can look to the one who promises to be for us all that we need Him to be. Lord, I ask and I pray that you would use this evening to turn our eyes and our hearts to you, and that we would discover in the midst of our grief and our pain and our sorrow that you are indeed good, and we can trust you in your wisdom. We can trust your sovereign plans. There are things that we're learning about you in the midst of our suffering and sorrow that apart from those things we would never know you by. So we give you glory tonight for being the promise keeper, the sustainer, the giver of hope, the healer, the comforter, who comforts us in all of our afflictions, so that we may comfort others with the same comfort that we ourselves have been given. Thank you for using this night to be that kind of thing. Get all the glory from it, Lord, and give us all the help from it, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.